Can folks hear me? Is this on? Yeah? Oh, okay. Hey everyone, I'm Asha. Thanks for coming tonight. I know Dana kind of introduced the series a little bit, but Chicago Conversations, I'm really excited to be moderating and partnering with Haymarket on this series, and to really get into just some of the conversations on different topics about the actual how we get to a more equitable city, a more liberated world, and like move a little bit closer to a vision of a better type of society. So we've invited organizers and community leaders of different types to be a part of this series. This is our third one. If you haven't participated in any of these conversations yet, welcome. We did one on public safety, we did one on building progressive political power, and today we're here to talk about housing justice. And, you know, in the city of Chicago, with a very rich organizing tradition, fights for housing, whether it be around land, around affordability, around desegregation efforts, is like a really big part of the context in which we all kind of organize, and the shoulders of the legacy of progressive and left and black and brown and working class organizing that we inherit in this city. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to dig in with folks that are leading just a wide variety of incredible work around this issue. So, yeah, I'm just going to get into it. I'm going to ask each of you to tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do, particularly as it relates to housing and housing justice and what you are fighting for in the semi-immediate future. So I'm actually going to start with Wayne from Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, an organization that's really been around for decades. So can you tell us a little bit about the history of CCH and your work there?
Sure, yep. Can you hear me? All right, cool. All right. So, CCH has been around since 1980, so it is a long-time standing organization fighting for housing justice in the city of Chicago. It got founded, I wasn't there at that time, but it got founded by a group of social service providers who were just trying to find a response to the growing number of folks who were visible on the street experiencing homelessness. So the very beginning of the origins of the organization was just to try to get a response from the city in terms of providing resources for folks, access to services for folks who were living on the street. The organization itself, we see ourselves as a direct action organization, which for us means that we try to organize with people who are directly impacted by the issues that we advocate for. And I'm one of the organizers at the organization. The organization tries to do the work that it purposes through a couple of different mechanisms. So we have a department that's an organizing department. We also have a policy department, and then we have a legal department. So we try to adapt to the landscape and the opportunities, right, to fight for justice for folks on a couple of different levels. One, creating enough groundswell of power, actual people power, right, behind the public policies that we'd like to advance, based off of the solutions that people say meets the rubber, where the rubber meets the road for them, which sometimes is very different than what folks in power might think are the actual solutions, right, that people need. And then we also have a legal department that takes on cases for folks who might have their rights violated as a result of some of the interactions with some of the institutions that serve folks who are experiencing homelessness. And when I say some of the institutions, I'm talking about just what they meet on their day-to-day. So there are some folks who get housed and may or attempt to get housed and are discriminated against in that process, which we all know is one of the factors that leads to people experiencing homelessness. And then also, as well, the rights of even homeless children as they may be in schools trying to access resources and help there. So that's the work of the organization. We are currently working on a campaign nobody in this room has probably heard of it, called Bring Chicago Home here in the city. Some people heard about it. And I think everybody in this room knows, up until this moment, and we're really in an exciting moment where, we have an administration that we are aligned and partners with. But I think folks know, it's been very hard to advance
Chicago Home, and I think it's great that a lot of people have heard of it, but I would love if you would actually just break down for folks what is Bring Chicago Home and why is that the solution that you all came to the problem of homelessness? Like, why is that the thing, and how might, it relate to other things that we also need?
So Bring Chicago Home it's a coalition, right? And it's a coalition of community groups and labor around the city that really recognize the fact that oftentimes we are pitted against each other in the environment to try to get resources for folks, right? And really was born out of the idea of how do we build this collective, right, that doesn't pit us against each other, right, that begins to build, if you will, long-term, right, sustainable solutions, right? One of the, I think, challenges we've seen sometimes when we think about housing, particularly subsidized housing, is how do you create an atmosphere that it doesn't erode, that it doesn't shift, that the priorities don't bend away from it as time goes forward, right? And so Bring Chicago Home was really rooted in how do you create dedicated revenue streams, right, for housing for folks who are homeless and housing insecure. And we've seen the dedicated revenue streams work for many, many things in our city and across cities across, the country. And so that was the idea around the dedicated revenue stream, if that answers the question. So that in the very beginning, and I'm trying to go back when the very first conversations happened. I think that probably was 2000, maybe in 16, with some of our grassroots folks, and we were just exiting a campaign where we were able to create units for housing for folks who were experiencing homelessness in the CPS school system. And it was a great win, and it was a small win, and it created about 100 units, and folks, our folks was like, we got to keep ramping it up, right? It was great that we were able to get this win, right? But how do we build on that? And I think that's always been a challenge for the organization. So we see this as the next step. We don't see it as, obviously, everyone knows in the room, solving the whole big question of homelessness, because all the different wonderful folks who experience homelessness come through it from many different paths, and it takes a lot of different solutions to get there. But this is where we started. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. Okay,
That's
now,
it?
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Yeah, Xanat, if you want to share, so OCAD, Organized Communities Against Deportation, has been leading anti-deportation and migrant justice work in Chicago for as long as I've been organizing, so like a little more than 10 years, maybe. So yeah, can you tell us a little bit more about what you all do, and how OCAD fights for housing and for people to have a safe place to be?
Yeah, so I came into organizing as an undocumented young person, middle 20s, in 2011. And back then it was an immigrant youth justice league, so it was just a group of us. I came into organizing because I was building community, finding other undocumented people with similar experiences that had just fought the deportation of another friend. In the process, creating the relationships and the friendships. And it was the first time, at least for us in the recent years, being public about our status and using that to mobilize our communities and networks of support, creating networks of support in the process, and finding that we can put pressure and keep people here in some circumstances. So the person was able to stay in the US in 2009 without status, just being allowed to stay in the US. And then after that, we started hearing other people in other cities that were also undocumented around our age, kind of also finding community and sharing experiences and finding patterns, commonalities. And as a young person, struggling with employment, struggling with stability, struggling with the idea of being in the US, that wasn't my choice, and coming to terms with this idea of displacement, forced displacement. In my particular case, I can say it was economic reasons, it was poverty, it was instability in that way, but also finding other people for other reasons or similar reasons being displaced. And so in 2013, after seeing how we could mobilize ourselves, build networks of support, seeing that challenging deportations in such a manner wasn't being taken by others, like, and that we often were that last resort for people in proceedings that wanted to challenge or like at least leave saying no. Even if they had to leave, at least they said no and they fought or visibilized what was happening. And so in 2013, we decided to just focus on deportations. Prior to that, we were also trying to tackle access to higher ed or work or health, visibility, and mental health as well. But I would say in terms of housing, well, one is recognizing that our being here is oftentimes forced displacement, not really a choice, easy choice, being displaced from our homes. I'm from Mexico. Recognizing that a lot of that is connected to U.S. imperialism. Like I went home in 2016 through advanced parole, which is through DACA. And I was surprised to see all the U.S. corporations like Starbucks, Petco, Home Depot, and just seeing like just how much more further the things that were making my stay in Mexico in the 90s was, you know, taking a hold, and just how much of a hold they had taken by 2016. So yeah, I think seeing deportations as a forced displacement, connecting it to that, and then also just us experiencing as poor people also in Chicago, or just making connections, just trying to be okay in Chicago as an immigrant community, and seeing also like there's a stake that we have also in fighting for resources, and not accepting this undeserving status of things. And so I think it was in 2016 when we started seeing the federal level become even more xenophobic and taking a hold. It was also about us focusing on what locally can we do in Chicago. How can we challenge Chicago that calls itself sanctuary city to actually be that for Black and brown people? And in connecting those fights and uplifting safety for all of us, and not this narrative that's often taken at the federal level, even local level, around like focusing on immigration, immigrants as the attack, or the divisions, and not really recognizing that we're fighting for better housing structures, we're fighting for better health structures, fighting for, and those are the things that will allow me to stay home or have a choice and be able to, move, which is one of the things that I think is really important for us. And then fast forward today, we see that, you know, again, this division of quote unquote immigrant crisis, but in reality, it's just a resource crisis that is just not seen or tackled that way. Seeing how there's a division of how we treat folks that are struggling with housing in Chicago and how we treat people that are arriving, but really the problem is the system of housing in Chicago, or, you know, so making those connections so that we don't pick populations as scapegoats, or, you know, I remember someone saying, like, not accept this idea that there's a line to access resources. There's no line. There's no need to accept lines for basic needs that we have, and it's just about, you know, making sure we're a unified front, asking for those things.
Thank you for that. And I'll just ask a follow-up that anyone can respond to. You know, I think we're in like a polarized moment when it comes to conversations about different communities and, you know, the access that they need for resources, for shelter and housing. And so, I'm curious for anyone on the panel who wants to speak to just like, what do we have to gain, you know, and, you know, we might typically think about immigrant justice work as like one category, and then housing justice work is like put in a different category, but like, what do we have to gain by thinking more holistically about people's right to, you know, or people's relationship to place, people's right to not experience displacement, and what the solutions, you know, that we need when people do. Like, what do we have to gain from thinking about things in like a more integrated way, if anyone has thoughts on that?
Hello? Okay, cool. Sorry, that cough was crazy. Like, it really got in there. My name's Dixon Romeo. I'm a member of Not Me We in South Shore, where we do housing and tenant organizing. We're leading on the South Shore CBA campaign, trying to get protections against displacement around the Obama Center. We do tenant organizing in South Shore and adjacent neighborhoods. We do youth organizing, parent organizing, mutual aid. So I'm tired, clearly. But I think that your question is really about, like, when we say like the polarized moment, we're talking about like the human trafficking, right, that's going on, right, where the governor of Texas is putting people on planes and buses, regardless of the information they have or like what's going on to the city of Chicago and the way that the city and the response from like residents, right, like that's what you're talking about. And I think that, like, so for example, one of the buildings where we have a tenant union, it's a 6618 South Kenwood in Woodlawn, right, the 312 tenant union we've been organizing for the past couple of months, right. I think it's a really interesting, or I think it's a microcosm of this larger example of what's going on. Like, you literally have a building that black tenants organized for months to get taken to building court in order to get the building to get the issues addressed. And at the same time, the same landlord is getting money from the state to house new arrivals, right? So no one in that building, when we talk about like a resource or a line, like no one is living good in that building, like not a single person. And so this idea that like, and I've seen, just literally with my own eyes, I've seen black residents who are fighting eviction from their landlord, organizing their tenant union, provide more resources than anyone from the city of Chicago did for any of those folks. And so this idea that like black communities are against, new arrivals, or like new arrivals are getting all these resources, like this is, to me, it's like not factual, and I think plays into the larger issue, which is that not only the city itself, but like property owners, right, and the folks who manage and create these different systems, whether they're vouchers or whatever, like all this is structured around like actually not empowering people regardless of where you're from, right? And I think that we have to, for us in our organizing, but I think for also us in like this discussion, right, think about like the folks who actually benefit from that. I think usually we talk about like capitalists or like privatizers or like landlords, like, just like amphibious thing, when yes, it is those folks, but also it boils all the way down to like the building inspector, right, or the mayor of the city, or like the governor or whatever, right? Like the reality is there's like 3 different people who want to be president, and because of that, nobody wants to address, right, the new arrivals in the city, right? And that is part of what's going on, right? And because we have like a glorified like prom, right, which is the DNC coming, people are like, well, we got to do this, we got to do that, and and that is what's important. And so to me, it's like those are the things that I think actually warrant the discussion versus like this idea there's like some black and brown feud over resource, because like no one is living good, and even if you do have folks getting vouchers from the state or not getting vouchers from the state, the reality of it is that like the voucher system doesn't benefit anybody long term but the property owner, right? So it's like that's the issue, right? Like that thing should not exist in the first place, right? And this idea that we can like fight for housing in like a narrow lane and not think about the whole market and like all the pieces that work into it feeds into that issue, right? Like there's this like we just give up on public housing and we'll reinvent like a new thing, and we'll, like I'm a big supporter of social housing, and I think that like, we can't push for that and ignore the fight for public housing, right? Like we cannot fight for social housing and then give away public housing land. Like all of that is part of the issue that we face in the city. Like we literally, it frustrates me because of the work we do and all the work that everyone on here does to get up here and say we have a housing crisis in the city, and then at the same time watch a city council meeting, and the end of the meeting is just them reading off the rolls of like land that we're giving away for free to a developer. And it's like, I like CVS and I like going to see the Bulls game, and I like the White Sox and all that, but like literally, right, we have 30,000 people who've been brought to the city who aren't getting adequate resources. We have 68,000 people who are homeless, and people are asking our mayor questions about, are the White Sox going to move down the street? Right? Like that's what's going on. And so to me, the issue isn't the person from Venezuela who's been brought here living in Woodlawn, like they didn't ask to come to 61st and Kenwood. Like they don't know what the fuck going on. I also don't blame the folks who've been living at 61st and Kenwood for decades who want their community to have resources and don't want to be displaced. I blame everybody else in that line, right, who's sitting there talking about the White Sox, right? Like I don't give a fuck about the White Sox. Like we got bigger shit to do with that land and with the resources the city has. And so that's what I would say to that.
Cool. You touched on like all of my next questions. Thank you. You can just, so thank you for that analysis. Dixon. I am going to ask you another question.
Oh.
You can hang on to the mic. Thank you for that. So you mentioned the work that you do with Not Me We a little bit. So could you just tell us a little bit more specifically, like what are y'all fighting for with this Obama CBA? And then if you could talk a little bit about the tenant organizing that y'all are doing, how does that fit into what you're trying to win, and what actually does that organizing look like?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with the tenant organizing because I think it informs and guides a lot of like the larger kind of policy stuff. We're also on the steering committee and part of Bring Chicago Homes. Like we've been fighting with Wayne and other folks me and Wayne been blocking elevators and fighting with like for years, right? Working on stuff like this. I think the broader housing policy work is really, really important because obviously you want to have an impact on as many people as possible in whatever area, right? And so with the Obama CBA, it's based off a really simple idea, which is, what can we do, what can the city do to make sure that everyone who lives in Woodlawn and South Shore and areas around the Obama Center not be displaced by the thing that is supposed to be there to benefit them, right? Which is pretty simple, right? It's not against the center. And so this is a struggle that's been going on for almost 10 years, right? Since since like 2014, 2015. And there was an ordinance that was passed in Woodlawn, right, which was not perfect, but it was historic and also inadequate at the same time, right? But South Shore got completely cut out of that because the alderman said, and I quote, like this displacement theater, like it's not a real thing. The neighborhoods are so different. Which was all crap, right? Like South Shore is the #1 eviction neighborhood in the city, right? It's a neighborhood that is 78% rental. The 5th Ward is the #1 eviction ward in the city. South Shore has been the #1 eviction ward in Chicago since 2010. Since the Lawyers Committee for Better Housing tracked eviction filing data. So like just mountains of evidence, be like, whatever, But that work is really, that's what the CBA is about. The tenant work that we do is really the heart and soul of everything that like Not Me We does, right? It's really centered on this idea about people need a home and a place to stay, right? And everything in your life is connected to that in every single way. Everyone who's in this room, whether you grew up with really stable housing or whether you grew up without really stable housing, I think you all can attest that having it or not having it had a significant effect on your life, right? Whatever your successes or your effort was, is built off of the fact that you had somewhere to lay your head, to study, to store your stuff, whatever, right? Or the lack thereof, right? And the tenant organizing we do is we don't just do HUD buildings, we don't just do like senior buildings, we do like, in my opinion, the hardest buildings to organize, which are like market rate buildings, because those tenants have the least amount of protections, you are the least vulnerable, and they're the hardest to organize because that is, again, the majority of the neighborhood, but also the majority of folks who need the protection the most, right? And so what that looks like is organizing tenants, starting tenant unions, supporting tenant unions, and then making sure that folks stop displacement, right, and don't get evicted or pushed from their home. And we've been pretty successful thus far in doing that across, I think, like 6 different tenant unions, some of them multi-building, some of them just single buildings, right? Like we've done 6 flats, we've done 22 buildings across, like we're working the 312 tenant union campaign right now is across 22 different buildings across different neighborhoods, right? Fighting a slumlord. Ariel and Rafa Lowenstein, their office is on 1912 South State. I'm snitching. And so I think that's what that looked. Did I answer the question?
Yeah,
Okay,
and
cool.
then just the last thing on this. So the Woodlawn CBA, my understanding is that the city has not fulfilled all of the promises that were made in that. And so, yeah, I'm just curious if in fighting now for a community benefits in South Shore in a very different political landscape than existed in 2019 when the Woodlawn ordinance was passed, like, are there any lessons in, like, what does it look like to fight for the city to implement something once they promise it?
Yeah, I think and I want to shout out my boy Nick right there. Nick, who's in DSA, he was really helpful, and DSA has been a part of us crafting that policy. The ordinance came from like community members, right? So we took things that people said, like, hey, gee, the rent too damn high. And I'm like, that's what, like, yeah, yep, that's all I gotta say. I'm leaving the meeting. I'm like, cool. How do we take that and translate that into policy, right? But anyway, I think part of it was like really looking at enforcement, like what can be written into the law, and like the city's law department, regardless of the mayor, is like, no, we shouldn't say that. And so like those are the things we fight over to make sure things get implemented in the right way. And I think that I'm sorry, I got lost. Your question was
Just like,
what's
what
the
are
difference?
lessons from the first fight that was won in terms of like, what does it look like to fight in a way that puts pressure on the city to actually like implement the things that they do?
Yeah, I think it looks like honesty, right? Like the reality of it, again, like the number one person outside of like the profiteers who actually benefits from the gentrification of Chicago neighborhoods is the city itself, right? Like the city is basically like the middleman for those folks, right? Like there is no office of the tenant advocate. There's a Department of Planning, Zoning, Permits, Buildings, Fines and Fees. Like if you want to go and take some money from some black folks, the city has no problem doing that, but they will make you jump through hoops and hurdles and everything to distribute funds, right? Because again, that's not profitable, right? Like that's not how businesses work. And so the city is a business. And so I think just being honest about that lesson, and that informs our strategy. So I think, I like Brandon, right? Like I know the mayor, and it doesn't change what we need to do for our communities, right? And being honest about that, I think is important. I think the other thing too is that the South Shore ordinance does focus, the Woodlawn ordinance focuses a lot on like vacant land and like development of affordable housing, which is really important. And also, if the majority of folks are already renting and you want to stop displacement, you would need policies for folks who are currently renting, right? And currently homeowners and currently there. So the South Shore ordinance, it's on the website, Obama South Shore, CBA.org. See, I'm getting better at the plugs. But it looks at literally every entryway in terms of housing in the neighborhood. So what are the barriers to you getting into a unit you can afford? What are the barriers for once you're in the unit? And then what's the things to protect you from getting displaced out of that unit, whether that unit is a condo or a home or an apartment, right? And then there's also our work around Bring Chicago Home, I think is us addressing something that we missed in the CBA. Was like there are some things, but not a ton around if you're homeless, not doubled up like on the street, how do you get into a unit, right? And so that's why we do Bring Chicago Home, because that helps us like miss that gap. And so that's kind of the lessons that we're learning, right? You cannot piecemeal systemic solutions in the neighborhood. They have to be holistic, right? And so despite what any people who, that's why we don't want our ordinance broken up into pieces, looking at the camera, like, we need one ordinance, right, that does the thing that it needs to do, so.
Cool. Okay, I think that's a good segue. Alderwoman Angela Clay, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I know that you've organized around housing long before you were in city council, so if you want to just tell us a little bit about what that work has been like, and then what do you see as your charge in city council?
Burn it down.
Yeah. When it comes to this issue.
Thank you, first of all, for having me, and welcome to the 46th Ward. Y'all, if you've never been here before, you are in the jab smack middle of one of the best communities on the face of the planet. Very biased about that. Alderwoman Angela Clay, it feels still surreal to say that, even though I've been here for 8 months, because my life has always revolved around solutions and people, because I'm a human. So my life, if you don't know, I am a product of affordable housing. My family literally raised me in multiple generations in an affordable housing, beautiful 3-bedroom, 2-bathroom, a half a mile from here. And I lived in that affordable housing unit up until the start of the first time I ran, right? I was working at the Federal Reserve Bank, making a salary for the first time in my life, actually getting health care. And I still was able to live in affordable housing, right? And I think that's something that people miss, is when you say affordable housing, people just assume that it's free. They assume that you have no goals, that you are uneducated, and that you just want to be a freeloader. And so I've always tried to use myself as an example of why affordable housing is so important, why housing stability is so important. right? Because you cannot think if you don't know where you're going to lay your head at tonight. You can't plan. You cannot even see the future because you're only thinking about your immediate needs. And we all know that housing is the bare minimum, right? So I have been organizing around housing since I was in high school, just because I feel like young people really tell the truth. And at the moment, it was a point in time where we were looking at why were students dropping out of high school in Chicago public schools. When I was in high school, the dropout rate was 50%, which meant either me or Dixon, and it was going to be me, okay? Which is horrible to think like that, right? But then we started to ask questions around what was the real issue? Why were students dropping out? And a lot of that was around the resources and lack of housing. Right? You have children who are bouncing from home to home, who don't know where they're going to do their homework for the night, what they're going to eat, and they can't focus the next day in school, right? They are literally in a sink or swim situation. So when I first got hooked into that, it motivated me to continue to push and ask questions, and also look for solutions. So when I ran this second time, anybody who knows me knows that my motto has been development without displacement, because, you know, you get into this conversation where people try to pin you into a box and say, you just want housing for the poor. No, I want housing for everybody. Honestly, I don't care how much you make, baby. I don't want you to be spending 60% of your monthly income to your biggest bill, which I'm sure we can all attest is our rent or our mortgage, right? That is just unstable, especially in times like we are right now. We're seeing a shift, right? Millennials, Gen Z, you can't just, send us to work anymore. We push back, right? So with knowing that, you have to pivot. You have to get creative. And you also still have to provide the bare minimum, which is housing and quality housing, right? Because I get this question all the time. The 46th Ward has been home to houseless neighbors for decades. And people always ask me, can't you just get them off the street? No, I can't. Because it's multifaceted. If you go to a houseless neighbor and you say, hey, neighbor, I want you out of this tent, but the only place I have for you is on 167,000th place. How are they going to get there? What resources are we providing them with? What community is going to be there to welcome them with open arms and be that buffer and be that crutch? That's why people live here. They set up, if it's in a tent, a car, a condo, it is because this ward has resources that they need to benefit from too, right? So it's always a tricky situation because people think you just get 4 walls and that's all you need, and that's not, right? So you have to couple it with resources, you have to couple it with social services, you have to couple it with community in order for people to actually thrive and get to a place of stability. So being in this position now as an elected official, it's different because I approach policies from a human aspect. I know what it feels like to question where your next meal is going to come from some nights. I know how it feels to wonder if you're going to get targeted by your landlord because you're organizing because your heat isn't on at 68 degrees in the wintertime, right? So those things matter to me. I think they're important to public policy. I am a nerd. My degree is in public policy from DePaul. So I approach just how I interact and want to make a change from a human standpoint. So I think my charge is to be myself in city council because it's so easy to get lost in this sauce, y'all. The sauce is saucy in City Hall. Woo. It's just to be myself. It's to support my community that got me here, and it's to continue to push the fight to make sure that everybody has the resources that they deserve.
Thank you so much for that. So I would love to hear, specifically, what are some of the things that you feel like we could win around housing?
Bring Chicago home, y'all. Okay, come on. Let's have an honest conversation. Bring Chicago home is going to pass. And I don't talk like that just because of arrogance. I talk like that because I think we are all seeing a shift in the need, right? Bring Chicago Home transcends generations. It transcends communities. At the core, it is what we should have been doing all along, right? And so I do think that the push is for each and every last one of us to educate people, because what I'm seeing is that people don't know what Bring Chicago Home truly is. They hear the word, they think that for some reason they're going to be impacted, and I'm like, you're a renter. Do you have $1 billion home in your back pocket that I don't know about? And also educating the folks who do have $1 million homes in their back pockets, right? That this is actually something that is going to benefit us in the long run. So Bring Chicago Home is huge. I definitely think that the charge that Dixon is leading is going to open the floodgates for other CBAs to actually step up, because it's something that's needed. Look, you can't come and colonize a community and not give them the resources that they deserve and they need. That just is not, it's not possible, especially in the city of Chicago, okay? We hold no bars. And so I think the CBA movement is something that is completely needed. And once Dixon makes the path forward, there will be tons of communities to follow. Last but not least, I do think that we have to continuously pressure to build more affordable housing. You have to pressure the city to build more affordable housing because it impacts everyone. Again, it doesn't mean free. You could be a college student, you need affordable housing. You could be a retired teacher on a pension, you need affordable housing, right? You need to just make sure that you are solidified in a way that you can plan for the future. And all of that comes back to housing. So I think those are 3 big wins.
And are there any, I'm curious, like, if you've learned or started to think about the problem and solution around housing differently since being in city? Like, are there new barriers that you are seeing now in terms of like how hard it is to win some of like the big stuff that we want?
Yeah, because it's all departmental. The city is broken up into departments that damn near don't talk to each other, which is whack. How do you live in an ecosystem where you don't even talk to each other, but you are dependent on each other, right? So a lot of these things are because, 1, lack of communication. They don't talk to each other. 2, it's lack of forethought, right? If a developer comes and they say, I want to build because it's going to bring this much tax revenue. People hear tax revenue and they're like, oh yeah, hurry up, build that. But you're not looking at the long-term effects of what that will do to that community itself or the people in that community, right? So I think the thing that I'm most excited about is the new incoming, I call us the freshman class. We came in eyes wide open. We came in asking questions. We came in being like, you haven't talked to that department? Let me teach you, right? We also just today appointed a new commissioner of the Department of Planning and Development, who is a smart, young, energetic Black woman from the South Side of Chicago, right? Having someone who actually knows the city, who actually cares about development without displacement, who actually wants to create a path with us and not for their own political gain, I think it's something that we should all be excited about. But again, you got to keep your foot on these people's necks. I'm an organizer at the core of this. Don't just give up because your favorite alderman got to City Hall, right? Help them. If you truly believe in them, you have to help them push for all of these things. You cannot leave us in here by ourselves, y'all, okay? It is a lot of work, and then people don't understand that it takes community to get things done. So that's what I've learned so far.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I've got one more question, and then I imagine that you all might have some questions. So start thinking, and then we're gonna ask you to come up here. So maybe get ready to stand up. Yeah. So I want to ask folks to talk a little bit about how public housing does or doesn't fit into your vision of a pathway to housing for all, to a more equitable city when it comes to housing access. And, you know, I just read Ben Austin's book about Cabrini Green. And, you know, I think at a certain point in time, Chicago became, right, like the example of the failure of public housing. And then in the aftermath of that, even today, you know, not today, yesterday, doing campaigning work for Bring Chicago Home, it's like one of the things that people say is like, well, they said they were gonna, you know, because one of the pushback we get is like, people don't believe it's really gonna happen. Like, we're gonna pass this thing and the city's not gonna do it. And, you know, still to this day, people are like, well, they said they were gonna rebuild affordable housing, or they were gonna rebuild a different type of public housing, and it just didn't happen. And, you know, that's followed by black folks not being able to afford to live in the city anymore. So anyway, that's like some of the context, but obviously there's problems with what public housing looks like. So, you know, is that an important part of your vision for how we get to a more equitable housing landscape in the city of Chicago and more broadly? And what are just like some of the things that you think about there? And I'd love to start with you, Wayne, if you want to chime in on this question. And I know you have to leave us early, so if folks have questions specifically for Wayne, we're going to have to get them to him later.
Thank you, Asha, for that. I think I want to start maybe where Dixon left off and mentioned. I think you need multiple things to be happening on multiple levels, but I think it has to start with understanding what's our ability to shift or change the things that have impact the success of it. Like, when you go back to, you know, Cabrini Green, I think it's a similar thing with public housing around many areas, is that folks who are powerful want to concentrate it in a particular area, in a particular neighborhood for a certain group of folks. And as everyone has said, as Alderman says, as everyone here has said, you know, that quality, housing impacts your quality of life. When you do that, you end up with the results where folks don't have enough of the basic things, right? Because you concentrate in that poverty. You know, at CCH, we believe like homelessness happens because it's the worst case scenario of poverty, or one of them, right? So you start looking at what creates that, right? There's a motive for profit, right? There are authors of inequality, right? And they're baked in some of the systems, right, that we look to for answers. So I think there's that. We need to really start taking a hard look of how we're pushing for and demanding and making the equity analysis within these systems where there's all these millions and billions of dollars, right? Like, there was a report I read that came out, I think, from 2021 that just talked about in that year, there was a 31 something $31 million surplus or reserve that the CHS had of unspent money that should have been spent on repairs and maintenance, right? So people looked at Cabrini Green and said, and put the charge of that, the optics of that, on the actual residents, right? But the system of not doing the maintenance and repairs, right, equaling empty buildings that can then be sold, right, through mechanisms, right? Some of them built into how the system comes down from HUD, right? So now you can sell that property, right, to someone that's doing private development, right? They might even be trying to house folks in there, but then you see this continuous, if you will, constant deterioration, shifting of the land, displacement of people, right? And you saw that in Cabrini Green. And, you know, the reality of it is there's a formula, I think, that we need to take a look at what it serves. The folks that are originally from the neighborhood who get mixed out, right, in mixed development and things like that. So, yeah, and I also just think we have to be really realistic of the landscape in Chicago, in that, and the times that we're in. Because if we're going to build, it's very expensive. Materials and costs for construction right now are very expensive, right? Land is very expensive, right? So when we think about that, I think, Asha, to your point, we really have to do a hard analysis of what's our ability, where are we creating the political will, and like, how do we want to reshape, right, how we apply the methodology of how we do public housing, right? I think it has definitely has to be baked into the fabric, because so much of the disparity that we've seen over decades and decades have created folks that are at this point being preyed on, right? They're being preyed on in terms of housing choices. They're being preyed on in terms of jobs, right? Jobs and housing go together. As Alderman Clay said, you can't separate those two. So I think, yeah, we have to kind of reimagine that, but we also have to be really honest with ourselves around what the challenges are and what are the changes that need to happen, and, you know, how that change needs to happen over a very long period of time, right? And I think one of the struggles for us always at the Coalition for the Homeless is there are folks sleeping outside without anything to eat, without any response right now. And as we keep imagining things that are 5 and 10 years away, when, you know, and it's being imagined maybe by some folks who don't have to deal with that day to day, they're comfortable, they have no problem, right? They have a whole plan for the next 10 years. And so Alderman Clay says somebody's trying to figure out what the next 10 minutes is, right? So there is that. There's that piece of it too. I think as just last thing, I think as we look at how funds come down from the federal government too, we have to take the reins of how that gets implemented and distributed in the locales, right? Because ultimately it's going to be the local agencies, and the local agencies have some struggles, right, with how to implement something successfully. That'll really be in charge of that in terms, and, you know, that funding source generally, historically, it needs to be coming down from the feds, but I think we have to deal with the issue with the local authorities, right, first. So, and thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry, I have to go.
Thank you.
See y'all soon.
Thank you so much. Do other folks want to comment on this, or should we go to Q&A?
I can maybe say a couple of things. Like, the way I see the current situation we have in Chicago and other cities, I see empty buildings. I see families having, recently I was being told, put a tent here, and then I also see folks that have been here take the tent away. I see, the fight for federal funding and resources, but I also see like a lot of empty buildings and a lot of landlords that use these empty buildings for tax breaks. I see the way that our shelter systems are punitive in places that people cannot be there for more than a few days. It becomes even more strenuous in people's health and well-being to be in those situations. And choosing to expose themselves to the element as a better choice. And so I think about the ways that we see housing as a way to build capital or like wealth, or like we see as you don't deserve it, you have to prove to me that you deserve housing, but also, you know, having to recognize that for us to be good in community and respect life, we have to acknowledge that housing is a right just as water, air is, and with all those other resources that come with it for someone to be well. And so I think it's shifting how we view and use housing and who has access to it. Thinking about federal funding as an immigrant, I already think about, you know, if money comes from the federal government for public housing, it comes with restrictions for immigrants. And so, again, it's playing again to like who deserves this money and who doesn't, what humans deserve, the basic thing of shelter that I think is just as basic as water and air. And so I think it's restructuring or the way that we see this basic need. And also, it's not that we don't have it, it's how do we make it accessible to people through policy, through actions, through, you know,
I was just going to add that, you know, public housing is just one tool. It's not all the tools in the toolbox. It's just one way that we have leaned on, and I think the reason why we've seen things like Cabrini Green happen is because the intent was never to help people get out of poverty. The intent was just to put them somewhere that they would be concentrated enough that we wouldn't show our guests when they came to the Magnificent Mile that we actually had poor people, right? So it's just one tool, and again, you have to look at the span of resources that we have. I'm really big, y'all, on co-ops, right? Why is anybody not talking about co-ops? Because not only does it give you shared responsibility and shared finances, it gives you equity. Nobody's teaching us about equity, right? And so when you're thinking about how do we, public housing is great, but it also perpetuates poverty because people feel like they can't go to the next level because their rent is going to astronomically increase, and then how can they ever afford, right? So I think that when we're talking about tools, public housing is just one of them. We obviously still need it, but it has to be intentional. It has to be intentional, and it has to be thought out well beyond just you need 4 walls. We have to think about what is the long-term gain. And then some of these policies are still racist. They're very much so embedded in the racism of this country, and they're old. One policy that I learned, you all, is you cannot be, this is HUD guidelines, I don't know if it changed, but in 2019 it was still the same. You cannot be the head of your household, which is your leaseholder, right? So you can't be the head of your household and a full-time college student if you do not have a dependent. So think about that. So in order for you to go to college full-time and still hold your lease, you have to have a child, which is hard as hell. How backwards is that? If the goal is to get them out of poverty and to get them in a better space, and they are using education as a tool to get there, why are we making them have a child? Which is going to equally put so much more pressure and weight on them to just do the bare minimum, right? So it's multifaceted, but again, we have to look at the entire picture instead of just relying solely on this one aspect.
Yeah, I think that Alderperson Clay earlier was talking about the perception of like what someone living in subsidized housing or like the state subsidizing stuff. And I think that like, the question around how does public housing fit into our larger vision around housing, to me, it makes me think about 2 things. Like one, the reality is like, if you take South Shore Woodlawn, for example, the Obama Center is on a 99-year lease that they got from free, right? So that's free land. The University of Chicago does not pay taxes and often pays, right, to subsidize professors, students to live in the neighborhood, right? Any business that's come in recently or that will come in post the center, it will be getting some sort of incentive from the state, right? So literally everything in a mile radius is subsidized, but me or other folks who want to live in, like, you got to pay full price. Everything else can be subsidized, right? Like that's like insane. I think that, again, if we broaden it and look at citywide, right? Like public housing to me should be the foundation of all the things that happen in the city, because if we leave housing up to the free market, right, whether it's ownership or not, right, like the only thing that's going to happen is the price is going to increase, right? Because what other reason would you get into this business venture and put this money into it? So there has to be a place where that doesn't occur, and that needs to be the public, the social, and then co-ops and other things are part of that full spectrum and vision, right? Like again, the idea that I'm a big NBA fan. Like I love the NBA, right? The same guy that owns the Bulls owns the White Sox, right? Which we were talking about earlier, right? The mayor, I don't know the last time a reporter asked Brandon Johnson about CHA land being sold, right? But I saw 3 questions today about Jerry Reinsdorf, right? And the White Sox getting the stadium again, like, down the street more or less, right? And the idea that, it makes sense to publicly subsidize a building where 20,000 people show up to watch 24 people, Zach LaVine finna go 6 for 20 on the field, right? They're not gonna win. No, like it's the truth. They're not going to win. No one in this room is going to play on that floor. We pay to enter this space. No, I've never been to a public event at the United Center, right? But we cannot build a building for 20,000 people where those folks can become a teacher, can become a bus driver, can cure a disease and become a doctor, can become a lawyer, can be the Alderwoman, right? We don't want to invest in that, but we want to invest in this thing, right? And the people who live in public housing, you can't go 6 for 20, right? Like you cannot, like to succeed, you gotta go crazy every single day of your life. And so I think for me, this idea that public housing is something that we need to like leave behind. And again, no one up here thinks that, but I get very frustrated when I sit in meetings, you know, with different folks who actually don't know, as Alderwoman Clay was saying, actually don't know the inner workings of city policy the way directly affected people do, right? And that's what I mean when I'm talking about you can't go 6 for 20. Everybody that I know or that we've organized that lives in rental housing or public housing or housing voucher, they know the rules down pat, right? Everyone who's been, you know, poor can tell you how many months you can go without paying a bill before they shut it off. And in the winter, they can't shut it off if it's under 28 degrees, so you can slide another 2 months. And if you go to credit union, you can finesse like this, right? And then I sit with people who may have a degree or have a position, but you're going 6 for 20. So I kind of can't even really like look at you in that way. And I think that that is the connection around public housing, right? Like I think you really touched on it. Who do we think is worthy to be mediocre, but also who is worthy of having the stability needed to be successful? And I think that we cannot have that in a city without having a space for anybody, black or white, new arrival or not, to be able to have a place to have a foundation. And you can't have that consistently without public housing. So I think it's essential to all of our plans and goals around housing in the city.
Thank you all for that. We've asked like a version of this question in all of these sessions, and I think we'll like continue to, you know, and I see whether it's us talking about public safety or housing or like other issues, us as like a part of a political project of beating back neoliberalism that has like left us with decimated public institutions and like not just a city, but a world that's more unequal than it's ever been in human history, and many people, you know, more insecure. But also that means that, you know, we have public institutions that are like in ruins or underfunded or were created, like you mentioned, backwards to begin with. And so even if we are socialists or believe that all the city resources and institutions are ours and belong to us, you know, how do we actually claim them, and what does it actually look like, and what's possible in that context? So thank you all for that. Cool. I am going to open it up to everyone else to ask some questions. Okay. I'm going to try to take a few at a time, and I'm going to ask you to come forward. So I saw you had a question. Julio, you can come up too. You can come. Jesse and Kate, and then we'll do another round after this.
So I have a couple comments and just a question. So I think the first thing is just the ARO or like rules that we have. It allows developers to pay $100,000 per affordability requirement in the building. That needs to go, because the way that this system is designed is you pay $100K per unit that is not affordable, and that goes into a fund for affordability. So the reason why we have of like, oh, well, we can't get rid of that because we currently rely on that in order to create more affordable units. But it's like a slap on the hand to a multi-million-dollar developer to only pay $100K per unit. Like it creates further inequity in the city. Second thing, TIF. Like Lincoln Yards is not blighted, and TIF was created in order to help develop blighted areas. So we need to have like an intentional way that we can develop in areas where people don't already want to develop. So we already know people want to go to like Humboldt Park, for example, where like people's property taxes are skyrocketing 300%. But then like for me, I'm from the 10th ward. Like what we get is like metal shredders, and you know, today an ordinance was introduced to allow mining in order for the Inver project to start. So it's like, how can we, okay, so then there's my question. How can we more intentionally plan around the city so that areas that are already, you know, attractive to investors, we don't have like where that's where all the investment happens and then everyone else gets all the leftovers?
Is anyone else's question like related to that? Okay, we'll take them anyway.
Oh, I was just gonna get in line.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Denise. I have two questions, and then I'll just sit down. But number one, where does the CHA fall among all these things that you were talking about? And number two, the money that comes from HUD, where is that tracked? Line by line, where is it tracked?
All good questions.
You want to answer them?
Yeah, I can hit on it. So there has to be better. There's a tracking system for HUD funds. Now the issue comes when HUD releases those funds to other organizations. That's the kicker, right? Because then they also now have their own tracking system that is their own database that is not shared, right? It's like you're in a grantee, awardee, do with this money. Obviously, you have ramifications, but they keep track of that. Secondly, the issue with CHA is it's on an island on its own. It says Chicago Housing Authority, but it is its own entity. City Council has nothing to do with CHA. And that's the issue that we're seeing here, is because when you are giving autonomy over yourself, of course you're going to do whatever you want to do. Duh, right? But that's the issue, is because how are you telling us that we have a housing crisis? CHA has millions of dollars that they are sitting on, and they get to do whatever they want because they govern themselves. They can do whatever they want. So that's the issue that, if you leave this room with anything of what's next steps, is to dig deep into CHA, honestly, from the top to the bottom. And this is no shade to anybody that's watching this that's in their leadership position. This is just facts, because you cannot tell me that you have a surplus of anything when there are people living in tents.
Did anyone want to answer the first question before we take a couple more? I think yes to Julio's points, but.
Go ahead, Dixon.
I think to Julio's question, there are two things. Like, one, the city comes up with, I think, a lot of creative methods over years, again, to avoid, basically people in power are going to try and appear to do the thing you want without doing the thing you want. And so, that is how you get TIFs, that is how you get, these other things. And I think the reality of it is that when we talk about most people, and we have a gentrification teach-in, which we do. We have one Sunday. I'm going to get flyers. Y'all can come. But 2 to 3:30, South Shore Library. But, we do a visioning thing, and we challenge folks on, why does your version of a good neighborhood sound like a gentrified neighborhood, right? And so what does development and investment in your neighborhood actually look like, right? Because from the real estate side, it's actually nothing that other people build. It's stuff that we and the public good pay for, right? The difference between a house, in Inglewood and a house in Lincoln Park is that it is geographically where it's situated, the closeness to the lake, right? The closeness to a really good school, right? The amount of people that live there, which means you have more business opportunities, right? Businesses don't create that, right? That's all stuff that the city does. And so when we talk about, I think part of, to your question around, what are the things we could do to actually get around the way we talk about planning and development in the city, is to actually reframe that and think about the public good and what things do we all have access to that make all of our neighborhoods better versus isolated things that at the end we actually get a very slim result from. Again, a lot of people could say an NFL stadium, right, which the Bears want, or the new White Sox thing I keep talking about because it really pissed me off, clearly. Right, I do not get the soccer stadium, right, on CHA land, whatever stadium you're talking about, right, none of us in this room are going to get any money from that. We can't even invest in that if we wanted to, right? Again, I'm a super nerd, right? How the sports leagues work. They split the revenue between the teams and the league as a whole, right? And so if you're not Jerry Reinsdorf or another owner of a team, you're not getting any of that bread. So how is that an investment in your neighborhood? Literally all that does is raise your taxes. So I think we have to reframe that. So I think, again, this idea about public housing, public schools, right? Public mental health clinics. There's a trend here around the things we're fighting for, because those are the things that bring benefit to a neighborhood, keep people in neighborhoods, keep the population high, right? Prevent displacement so that we can have sustainability, right? So.
I'll just say one thing on this too, and then I'll add it to the other questions, but I feel like some of the stuff that we're talking about, including specifically the problem that you're talking about with TIF funds, is like, a part of why that's a problem is like, we allowed people to be in office in our city that were like bankrolled by real estate interests for a long time, who like sat in those seats for their whole careers and could use, you know, public resources for their own personal gain, or like for that of the people that, you know, fund their campaigns to keep them in office. And so shaking up the way that, you know, that system works, I think is an important piece of not allowing.
Can I add something to that? I'm sorry. Is that,
Yeah. I'm just finish my sentence. Yeah, just not allowing people in power, right, to steal from us, which is exactly what you're describing.
Yeah, I think everything Asha said is correct. Sorry for jumping in too hard. But I do think also, and this is no shade to like Harold Washington or nobody else, but like even the idea of TIFs though, like again, if we dig into it, is that I'm going to take money from this whatever neighborhood or region that is not doing well. Your public needs are going to increase. The roads deteriorate over time. The schools need things over time. And I'm not going to put the money into that. I'm going to put it into something that is an investment. And again, that thing is something that's like private that like you don't own. So like even if, again, like if we have Angela Clay, who's a wonderful, like the perfect, you know, type of alder person, that's actually not the approach we need to be doing, right? In terms of creating money from the city, because it's still coming out of me and your pocket, as opposed to Jerry Reinsdorf, right? Like that's the thing I'm trying to get at, I think. So.
Cool. All right, we're gonna take all three questions at once.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jesse Sharkey. I'm a teacher in Chicago and a member of the Chicago Teachers Union. And thanks to the panel. You guys are great. I admire your work. My question is, how do we get a direct action protest movement on the question of real estate and the question of housing? I'll just say something about it. Housing is the biggest industry in this country. If you add rental, real estate, construction, all the financing of housing, it's over $4 trillion a year. It's the biggest profit center there is in U.S. capitalism today. That's not there are villains in that. There are people who are getting really, really rich off the fact that the housing is unaffordable. In the schools, we got really good at developing campaigns that had some villains, that we actually got to picket people and protest. So, for example, the public schools lost $670 million or so in bad interest rate deals by playing the markets during the 2010s. And we went after the banks that did it. They didn't do anything wrong, quote unquote. They were just doing what banks do, which was make money off deals. Right? But we made them into villains for profiting hundreds of millions of dollars while school workers got cut off and stuff. And I'm really curious, what are the analogous things in the realm of real estate where we could get some pickets, where we could show up in people's lobbies, or we get a little bit rowdy with some people, because I kind of feel like that's what we need. I mean, policy is great. I love policy, but it's like the fact of the matter is there's people living on the street while other people get rich off of housing, and it makes my blood boil. Thanks.
I am always here to shut shit down, so let me know when we figure that out. What I've been really worried about is when my Cook County Commissioner was Brandon Johnson, he passed some really important ordinances that protected renters. And I wonder, how are we thinking about the ways that those things can be rolled back when people start saying, well, the only way that we can help unhoused people is by easing the things that we have put in place to protect renters?
Hey, thank you all so much. I really admire everything that you all do. My name is Diego. To try to keep it brief on the kind of tip about public housing and trying to change the foundational structure of the housing system. I mean, I guess I think of it very simply. If you look anywhere in the world, there are many places in the world where housing is not an issue, and that's because it's some combination of public housing or cooperative housing. They don't rely on the private market. I think it's very simple. But understanding from where we are, trying to get there, right? The Bring Chicago Home, and I just want to shout at everybody working on that and all the great, the tens of thousands of doors that have been knocked. There's no doubt in my mind we're going to win that, right? But that is also, like, just to be real, like, we're trying to address homelessness at the symptom. And my question is, as we are pushing and gaining power, and hopefully, with a sympathetic administration, what do you see as, like, say, the steps? There's a lot of organizers here in the room. What do you see as the steps that are going to be necessary to start having a more mainstream conversation and mobilized mainstream movement for these more fundamental demands, like, say, around building more public housing or cooperative housing, which a lot of people, for example, don't even know really about? How do you see the infrastructure of, like, the kind of movement to be able to get past the hurdles? Like, I mean, at Cabrini Green and at Abla, for example, where I live over by these old public housing complexes, the stigma was so bad that when they, demolished them, it was the residents themselves who were actually cheering it on because of how terrible the maintenance of them was and how it was just segregated poverty so heavily. And so even among the constituencies that we're trying to help the most, there's these stigmas that exist. So how do you see us kind of using the momentum of this current movement to move beyond that?
We'll take your question, and that'll be the last one.
Hi, thank you so much for everything you mentioned. Since getting plugged in with BCH, I've been obsessed with Vienna's social housing complex. I don't know if you guys have been on it, but it's so beautiful, utopia. And I think something we miss when we talk about housing is, like, community, and how the social housing experiment, especially, like, it's so many people in a building and beautiful grasses and parks. And I think I just like to, like, get a sense of, like, what should be done, either zoning or, like, taxation, to bring us a step closer to, like, I don't know if that's y'all's utopia, but, like, I would love to see spaces like that, especially where I live in 12th Ford, Brighton Park, where the lots we have are being built for, like, 2-story single homes. And it's like, you're driving people out. Like, let's try to make something bigger. So on the policy side, like, that kind of stuff, like zoning, what needs to happen with zoning, funding, right? Because I know Dixon mentioned the need to have money, right? To, like, or no, it was Wayne, for structures. So yeah, like, what kind of policy initiatives should be pushed for in the next decades or so to hopefully get us closer?
Thank you for that, and thank you for bringing up social housing. I think you mentioned Vienna? Yeah, like 3 in 5 people live in, like, social housing that's, like, guaranteed for, like, public social housing that's guaranteed for anyone at any income level. So I think that's, like, an interesting model to include when we're talking about public housing, for sure. Okay, so we had 3 big questions. How do we create a direct action movement for housing justice? How do we start rooting for kind of bigger picture public demands? And then if folks have thoughts on that last one too. And I'll invite folks to comment either on these questions and then any last words or calls to action that you wanna give, and we'll close on it.
I can just briefly speak to the direct action thing. As a person that's undocumented and has have to live outside of the law because that's the only way I can survive, I really agree that we have to figure out how to respond to the moment right now of thousands of people experiencing the winters of Chicago without housing. I don't know if people are aware, but over the weekend, we almost had 700 people kicked out of shelters of recent arrivals. And now that was extended to February 1st, where we're going to deal with maybe 1,000 or 2,000 evictions at that point in the worst months of Chicago. So I think it's supporting people staying put, or supporting people taking empty spaces and building all those mutual aid groups, or groups that were supporting individuals in police stations. Take that to empty buildings where people are going to have to stay. As OCAD, we are testing a new law, a state law that passed last year, the Abandoned Housing Rehabilitation Act. We're already seeing it's a very slow process for an organization to gain access to an empty building, a building that hasn't been used for a year, with the hopes of gaining some type of housing for individuals. And we're working with people that have experienced housing insecurity in Chicago as, people that were born here, but also people that are arriving. So testing and experimenting as community and building those networks of survival, because that's what we have to do. We have to think beyond the rules that exist right now, while pushing for the changes within the rules. So I totally support, and I think people are doing it. It's not just OCAD, it's not just, the organizations here. There's a lot of people that are taking buildings without those networks of support, and maybe we just make it a visible thing and, a thing that we practice as a community.
And what you said reminds me of the work of the Chicago anti-eviction campaign, and they were like occupying with families whose homes had been foreclosed on, occupying with like their organization, and successfully winning people's homes back. And that was not long ago. I think there's a lot of inspiration to draw from their work.
I feel like you're going to use my idea, but here it goes. Jesse, I feel like if, a couple hundred of us with our own tents went and tented out somewhere that people aren't used to it, could bring a lot of attention to this issue. Because it is about visibility, right? There are people who do not interact with poor people at all in any aspect of their life. And when they have to, whether it's jogging or walking their dog, they have an issue, right? With just physically seeing somebody in poverty. I think you need to make it a little bit more uncomfortable for them. That's just my personal opinion. Let me know if how it works out, because I would love to be there. You had a question, and I'm blanking out, but I have the answer.
It was about we have put ordinances in place to protect renters, and I'm worried about them being rolled back.
Yes.
The only way we can get landlords to help is if we ease the things that we've won to protect renters.
My answer was, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Because we got to get out of this mindset that it's either or. It's me or you. No, it's all of us. It's yes and, right? Yes, we can have these protections. Yes, small landlord, you will still get great tenants and viable income and stability, because that's what landlords need, right? When you start thinking in a context of a small business